Hi guys, welcome back to the Contented Plant. Today we are talking all about the Scindapsus Pictus. This is also commonly referred to as a satin pothos plant. This is the silver splash variety. It has these gorgeous leaves with these splashes of silver on it, and they have kind of a velvety sheen. So let's get into it. One of the unique things about this plant is it has these beautiful heart-shaped leaves, and they have these gorgeous splashes of silver across the top, and that silver part actually kind of glitters and shines when the sun hits it. It's just beautiful. It's a very unique plant, and you can get kind of different silver patterns on each leaf, which makes it really interesting to look at. Even though it looks very similar to a pothos plant and it has the nickname satin pothos, it's not actually in the pothos family. It's in a whole separate plant genus by itself. So the genus name for this plant is said to be derived from the Greek word Scindapsus, which means upon tree trunks. Basically, this is talking about how these grow in the wild. They are like most common epiphytes, and they attach themselves to tree trunks and grow up along the side of a tree, and they kind of go up and reach the top of the sunlight there. So if you were to find this plant, if you're walking around Southeast Asia where they're native, you're going to find it most likely climbing up these large tree trunks, and they kind of have a shingling effect when they're climbing up these trunks that's really cool, kind of similar to the Monstera dubia. They shingle themselves flat along the side of the trunk and kind of go up that way, which is really neat. I will put a picture in here if I'm able to find one. So these can be grown at home, either as a hanging plant that can trail, kind of how this one is. This one is not yet converted to a hanging planter, so this is just kind of sitting here. You can do this too, kind of how I have my golden pothos, where it sits along the edge of something and it's allowed to trail down. Or you can have it in a hanging basket, like I have with my Philodendron Brazil back here, and let it hang over the sides of the basket. Or you can put it on a moss pole or a trellis and allow it to climb. A lot of times when you allow these plants to climb, they end up putting out larger and larger leaves. It's just, that's their happy position. When they're allowed to climb, they do seem to do a little bit better. Most people do not have the room in their home to allow these plants to really reach their full potential, because you would have vines climbing and growing everywhere. So most commonly they're kept as a hanging or trailing plant, and they just kind of hang down and trail just like this. They have lots of nodes, just like a pothos plant, and you would cut in between that internodal spacing if you were going to propagate this plant. And you can propagate them in water or very moist soil. So unlike other variegated plants, this one is a little bit interesting with the lighting. A lot of times when I talk about a variegated plant, the more light, the better. That really encourages the variegation to keep coming through. Since these are not really a common type of variegation, if they are exposed to lots of direct sunlight, they can actually get scorched and end up losing their variegation. So for this plant, you're going to want very bright light, but it's going to need to be indirect light. You do not want direct sunlight beating down on this plant, because you can scorch those leaves. Although you don't want to keep it in super direct light, you are going to want to keep it in some bright indirect light. It will not grow very fast or do very well if you keep it in full shade. This plant is a little bit dramatic, and it likes to tell you if it's way too dry. If it's way too dry, the leaves will kind of start to give a wilted appearance, and they will start to curl in on themselves. You can quickly fix that by giving your plant a really nice dose of water. This plant is going to like moist soil, but it's not going to like to be oversaturated. Like most of the houseplants, it can get root rot if it's left sitting in really saturated, compact soil that's just hanging onto those roots. For watering this plant, I would water it every 1.5 to 2 weeks during the summertime. I always just use my finger, and I go in and I feel whether or not the soil is moist, you want it to be dry about 1.5 to 2 inches down before you go ahead and water it again. You do not want to walk by and just pour a little bit of water on it every day because it will get overwatered that way. I would not let this plant get too dry. If you let it get to the point often where its leaves are curling and it's really in distress, that's going to be really hard on your plant and affect the overall health of your plant. So try and maintain an even watering schedule for the best health of your plant. For soil, I would use a typical aroid mix. My favorite is 60% potting mix, about 20% orchid bark, and 20% perlite. Other people have different aroid mixes that they like to use. Really, it just needs to be kind of a lighter soil, a little bit chunky, something that allows the water to not only drain out, but allows those roots to get a little bit of air and movement through them. Soil that is too heavy and too rich on the soil side will just compact over time and hold that wetness around those roots. We do not want that on an aroid plant. You always want to make sure your pot has a drainage hole. This one is actually in a self-watering pot, which is kind of nice. So it has these two strings down here, and then what you do is you just put water in this little reservoir and the plant soaks up the water as it needs it through the strings. So that's an easy pot to use for a plant like this. So this pot is shallower than this pot, and you can see it just kind of suspends in there. It doesn't go all the way down. So that means that the roots and the dirt are not able to sit in that wet soil and kind of get too moist over time. If you don't have a self-watering pot, it will do just fine in a pot that has a drainage hole. Never try and grow your houseplants in a pot that does not have a drainage hole. It's just too hard to keep them watered appropriately, and you risk getting that root rot. If your plant is becoming leggy, and for a vining plant that usually looks like a really long spacing in between the leaves. Sometimes you can get a vine that just starts to have a huge amount of space in between the leaves, and that starts to make it look really leggy and not very pretty. That is usually a lighting problem because your plant is kind of stretching out and searching for that light, and that's a good sign that you need to move your Scindapsus into brighter light. These plants kind of have the reputation for being a slower growing plant. They're not going to grow quite as fast as like the Marble Queen pothos back there that just seems to grow every single day. I would not repot this plant until you see signs that it needs to be repotted. A good sign to look for would be the soil is drying out really quick, there's a lot of roots coming out the bottom, or the top of your plant is becoming really top heavy in that container. Since they are slow growing, you shouldn't need to repot this one very often at all. You can propagate this plant in water, you can propagate it in moist soil, or you can propagate it in some damp sphagnum moss. Whatever way you choose, you can cut it, and you just want to make sure those nodes are facing down if you have them in soil or sphagnum moss, and you want to make sure you have it in an area with high humidity. So if you're going to do the sphagnum moss method, a really popular way to do that is to place the cuttings with the nodes down in some damp moss, place a lid on the container. A lot of people like to use takeout containers for this, and that creates a nice tiny little greenhouse effect, and it will grow roots from there. You can keep it in a bright spot, and once those roots are about 2 inches long, you can go ahead and plant it right into moist soil. So to recap really quickly on the care, this needs to be in a bright spot, but an indirect light spot. Make sure you're watering it every 1.5 to 2 weeks. Make sure that soil is drying out at least a couple inches down before you're going ahead and watering it again, and keep it in a aroid mix or a potting mix that has a lot of light and chunkiness to it. I hope that answered all of your questions about the care for this plant. Please let me know if you have any more down below, and I will do my best to answer them for you. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time at the Contented Plant. Bye-bye.